σας και πάλι από την Αθήνα.
So, good morning once again. We're ready to proceed to our next session titled Climate Change Impact on Intangible Cultural Heritage. It is with great pleasure that with us digitally is the assistant professor with the Department of Methodology of Political Science, Faculty of Political Science and International Studies in the University of Warsaw, Ms. Hanna Schreiber. It's over to you. Thank you.
The title of my presentation is more general one, but I hope still it will be well connected to the previous presentations. So it will be about lessons learned from Elinor Ostrom and about linking these two very important topics. And before I start, I would like to thank you very much for your generous invitation and for the opportunity to share my reflections on the topic. First of all, I would like to introduce to you Elinor Ostrom, the person from the title. She was political scientist working at the University of Indiana, and she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for her analysis of the commons. The commons, and she of course contributed to the definition of the commons. She mainly was focusing on how communities govern their commons, understood as forests, fisheries, oil fields, or grazing lands. And she studied interaction of people for many years and collected a vast empirical data that has actually proved the previous theories wrong. And the previous theory that was explaining why governments should be involved was known under the term tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons, the Harding's concept says basically that people are egoistic, and if there is a scarce resource that shall be governed collectively, people will rather pursue their own goals and their own self-interests instead of keeping the resource sustainable in a long term and benefiting also others. And for many years, this concept was also in a way explaining the involvement of governments at different levels. And Ostrom actually brought empirical data and she was studying together with a vast team of researchers, different communities all around the world, how they govern their resources. And she proved that the communities can govern their resources effectively, and they can develop their own rules of governance. And these rules will be also the topic for my presentation. She was also involved in the debate regarding climate change, and thus the results of her research that I will present today were also presented on the eve of the debate on climate change, and she was also advocating the polycentric approach to climate change issues. So I will try today to link these concepts, intangible cultural heritage and climate, as commons, so shared resources, important for all of us. Then I will try to present the collective action problem, a typical problem for social sciences. Then I will try to link these issues with the concept of governing of the commons and 8 design principles that Elinor Ostrom saw as patterns through different communities. And at the end, I will conclude what it means to apply a polycentric approach to the problem. So first of all, let us try to understand what are the commons. There are plenty of definitions, and the most compact one and the most inclusive one that was developed by Ostrom and Charlotte Hess speaks that it's shared resources subject to social dilemmas. And when we think about intangible cultural heritage commons, we can think about different types of already inscribed elements. Tajichuan from China, or Rebetiko from Greece, but also beekeeping culture from Poland. All those intangible cultural heritage elements involve some rules that keep those practices in a long term transmitted from generation to generation, and also involve rules that govern the behavior of the users of these commons, so the practitioners, the bearers of ICH. I have highlighted here the Irrigators Tribunal in Valencia and Murcia, which was inscribed as to the representative list of humanity from Spain, because this particular element was also studied by Elinor Ostrom and is I would say a very well known example of how you can solve the issues related to the access to water if the water is a scarce resource for people living in this area of Valencia and Murcia. So if we think about ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage, as commons, we can also apply and think about the rules to govern them. What were the rules? And of course, if we look to the very broad pictures, we have very different rules that we apply to govern our ICH. Both most important were designed at the international level, and that is why we meet here. Because of the development of the 2003 Convention, which constitutes a global intangible cultural heritage regime with different legal norms, but also sorts of rules regarding behavior of states, involvement of experts, NGOs, and also other instruments that were developed around the convention. Not only the convention itself, but also operational directives, codes of ethics, ethical principles, modalities and principles for emergencies. So a set of very, very broad rules that we try to implement. And of course, this all interact with local, regional and national regimes that were developed in conjunction with the 2003 Convention and on the way of its implementation. And if we look into a even more broader picture, we can find commons in different areas. It's not only heritage commons, but also we speak about food commons, environmental commons, knowledge commons, cyber commons, and also we speak and research climate commons. These climate commons, so the access to fresh air, the access to water that are now very much infringed by climate change, involve design and implementation of different agreements, different governance rules that are aimed at solving the problems regarding to not only climate, but to climate change. And let me distinguish these two issues. The climate is a common good, whereas the climate change is perceived as a common bad, something that is happening to us and is very much influencing our opportunities to live in a sustainable way for future generations. And the same difference is needed when we speak about collective action problems. Collective action refers to action taken together by a group of people whose goal is to enhance their condition and achieve a common objective. And if we think about this definition, we see collective action everywhere when it comes to intangible cultural heritage, because it is practiced in groups, communities, in very rare cases actually by individuals. So group of people have a common goal and they try to achieve common objectives, which is the sustaining, which is usually the sustenance of the practice. And collective action problem is a situation in which all individuals would be better off cooperating, but fail to do so because of conflicting interests between individuals that discourage joint action. And these problems usually also evolve around the topic of free rider. So people who actually take benefits from what others contribute to the resource, but they themselves do not contribute. It's like, using the public transportation without paying the ticket. Somebody else pays for the ticket, so we have taxes to sustain public transportation, but we ourselves do not contribute it. So this is the common problem that is visible when we speak about collective action problems. However, Elinor Ostrom, by analyzing vast empirical case studies all around the world, from fisheries, vineyards, forests to irrigation system, she discovered that people actually are not sentenced to free riding. They are not sentenced to fail when they are left to decide about how to govern themselves. And she found around a variety of case studies 8 principles that are regarded as those key principles to have a sustainable and effective governing system for different commons. So first of all, it is clearly defined boundaries. So we know what we are trying to sustain, what we are trying to govern. There are some conflict resolution mechanisms at place, because usually when we have a collective action issues, we have some conflict. There are duties, but these duties are in reasonable proportion to benefits. There is monitoring and sanctioning that is carried either by the users themselves or by someone who is accountable to the users. Sanctions are graduated, so mild for a first violation, stricter as violations are repeated. And this is very well visible when we look at the irrigation tribunal of wise men who were solving the issues regarding the access to water. Decisions processes are inclusive and held in a democratic way. The right of users to self-organize is clearly recognized by outside authorities, and the whole system is nested, so it's connected and layered. And 20 years later, after the book, that was actually the main reason to give her the Nobel Prize in 2009, she was already involved in developing the adaptation of the theory of collective action. Ostrom, when analyzing also climate change problems, she said that actually we have to understand that while individuals do not, and we never possess perfect information, we are capable of learning more accurate information as we interact in a particular setting. So the matter of the context. This is quite important to understand, because we usually tend to see climate change as a global problem that must be solved at a global scale, because global problems need global solutions. This is exactly the opposite what Ostrom is advising us. She would say that actually any working structure cannot be worked out at a general level, as many specific features of a particular dilemma are context dependent. So we need to know what is the context, and we need to suit the working solutions to the particular context. So any policy that tries to improve the levels of collective action must enhance the level of trust, and we cannot actually gain trust globally. We gain trust in families, in social groups, and it is impossible to create this type of the level of trust that is needed for effective governance at a global level. So she and her husband, Vincent Ostrom, who actually invented the term polycentric governance already in the 60s, they were advocating the polycentric approach. The polycentric approach speaks about the system and not a hierarchy that involves multiple scales and levels. And what is important, what was not recognized by her in the 90s, is the need of a leadership and of social capital. If you look back to these 8 principles, we do not have any principles speaking about a leadership, but leadership is important to actually also create trust among the communities. Long-term horizon with active oversight of all involved stakeholders, which are contributing together to the system, and reliable information that helps to link different units through information networks and monitoring at all levels. What she herself says, what can we learn from this polycentric approach to climate change, and also something that will be relevant for thinking about how we govern at our nations the ICH issues. First of all, we have the complexity of causes of climate change and the ICH responses to it that were very well presented and addressed in the first panel. The second of all, we have to recognize that we have a real data flood. So we have a challenge of acquiring knowledge about causes and effects of climate change to different communities. And I myself must admit that it was an issue that I had when thinking about our Polish experiences with governing ICH, because we do not have right now the proper knowledge acquired about how people deal with that. And so instead of data flood, right now in Poland, we have data lack. But I hope that thanks to this forum and thanks to the inspiration taken from the presentation of other speakers, we can also develop more knowledge about it in Poland. We also have to understand that climate change topic is so broadly addressed and involves big funds that sometimes are used against the real needs and can sometimes effectively increase rather than decrease emissions. And we know after this many years how many so-called ecological and innovative solutions actually were causing even more damage to climate change than we thought. And of course, there is also the issue of learning, which means also making errors and trials and also involving frustration. But Elinor Ostrom was very, very honest about it. And I think that we should also take some positive and optimistic lesson from that. So policy implications, that is my conclusions, are that global climate change cannot be solved at a global level effectively. It must involve polycentric approach to the problem. But approaching climate change and focusing on how ICH communities react to climate change can be approached and analyzed in the governing of the commons language. And Ostrom framework actually helps us to understand better the governance dynamic and what is happening between people in the communities. So more reflective approach on the nature and quality of social institutions help us to understand better the problems of governance, and trust and reciprocity that we usually omit when we speak about governance at the global level might be key to understanding problems to governing the commons, and also some failures related to creating sustainable and effective global solution to climate change. So Elinor Ostrom would tell us that there is no one panacea for everything, but I believe that better understanding of the empirical research that she did, and also her followers and the whole so-called commoners community did in this area, might be very helpful in finding some panaceas for some things. And of course, at the end, we shall not forget that as it concerns ICH communities and it concerns our efforts to fight with climate change, trust is the most valuable resource that helps us to govern our shared resources. I would like to thank you for your attention and also tell you that tomorrow we will be celebrating in Poland the Corpus Christi tradition and flower carpets tradition that were inscribed in December to the list. And of course, even speaking to these communities, we could see that they are really influenced by climate change because it involves and it's very much connected to nature. Thank you so much for your attention.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Πραγματικά
Thank you very much indeed. What you just shared with us, Professor Schreiber, lies in the heart of this debate. We need to see how to empower the communities of ICH so as to make better use of available resources. So thank you once again. Now I would like to welcome Ms. Katerina Biniari, who is an associate professor and director of the Laboratory of Viticulture in the Agricultural University of Athens. Professor Biniari will speak to us about climate change and grapevine cultivation, challenges and prospects. Professor Biniari, it's over to you.
Good morning. Good morning to you. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Coordinator says we can see you and we can hear you loud and clear. So good morning once again to all participants. I should like to apologize for having my slides in Greek. And I would like to thank you very much for this graceful invitation to participate in this forum. It is in fact very important because climate change and safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. The subject of my presentation is climate change and the way that vines are cultivated and its adaptation, what problems we will have to face with climate change, and what are the solutions that will allow us to manage slightly better this climate change. Now, as we heard earlier, there are studies that say that at the end of the 21st century, the average temperature will rise by 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. The vine is very sensitive in such climate changes, and what is of particular importance is the viniculture products. Vinicultural products of the vine. The vinicultural products and the effect that this change in temperature will have, both in the various stages as well as the maturation course of the vines. The high temperatures. Mrs. Biniari, I apologize, you have turned off your camera, says the technician. Please Okay, turn on your camera. Now we can see you again. Right, okay. Speaker apologizes. So, high temperatures and radiation, along with this increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, appear to have an effect and a great impact on the annual cycle of the vine and the development and physiology of the stumps. We see in transpiration, photosynthesis of the stumps. So we're interested in how the cycle will be and how the physiology of the stump will be, but also the quality characteristics of the grapes and in the yields per hectare. The increase in temperature, we see that it differs. We will have an increase in the alcohol degrees, in the sugars and contained in the grape, and reduction in the acidity. So we'll need to find either varieties that are different or different qualities of ground, or the quality of these viniculture products that will respond better to climate change. We have effects on high temperatures, lack of water, and what we can see in Greece as well over the past few years, extreme weather phenomena, such as intense precipitation or hail, and depends on the stage that it will hit on the vine, we will have, or we do have, loss of viniculture products. If it's very early, we lose our production. There is an early maturation of the grapes. And there is a maturation of the grape that leads to problems in the quality of the viniculture product. So we would like this course of maturation to remain the same, to be more smooth, to receive the quality we want in sugars and acidity. So we have significant impacts on the qualitative and sensory qualities of the grapes and the produced wines and the alcoholic grades due to the increase of the sugars. And so these are the problems that we have. The very physiology of the plant changes. We have flower blooming is faster, and this is something that's happening over the past few years in Santorini, for instance. We have a destruction of the bloom of the taxianthe, and we have a reduction in the production. We have problems in the quality and the quantity of the vinicultural products. So this climate change will force the producers to change their strategy to deal with these problems. Now, in the measures for dealing with these problems, we have the quality potential that is very interesting here in terms of intangible cultural heritage. Various cultivation strategies will need to implement, as well as in vine installations that need to be proper, that need to take into consideration all these parameters that we mentioned earlier. The first thing I will look into is the variety potential. It is a long-term, I should like to say, way of dealing with climate change, with the variety restructuring, using local varieties, appropriate biotypes, clones that are desirable. Why? Because, well, by evaluating these local Greek varieties, we can deal and manage this climate change. I have various examples that we have to see that have to do with the difference in the consistency of these varieties or these biotypes. Another long-term way, is to have different systems, different education systems, different planting techniques. And I would suggest the more traditional ways of dealing it, because the more traditional way is adapted in the bioclimatic conditions. So there is knowledge for us to adapt in using traditional ways of cultivation and culture to deal with this climate change. In the short term, we can see that we have the management of the vegetation with pruning as the plant is still young, modification of the systems, supporting the stumps, because this is also very important due to the lack of water or of untimely precipitations. This is important, and another effective and economical solution may be the use of various aggregates that can actually be applied and reduce the biotic and the abiotic stress of the plants, protection from diseases and pests and enemies that change their cycle accordingly, and abiotic stress of the stumps. The first way for dealing with the problem is the varietal restructuring, the varieties that we have and that we need to evaluate in order to be able to use in this effect. Now, indicatively, I should like to mention the names of varieties mentioned in an ampelography of Viala and Vermorel of 1909, including 24,000 names that correspond to more than 10,000 varieties of vine of Vitis vinifera. In Greek ampelography of 1940 by Kribas, there are described more than 200 Greek vine varieties, along with their synonyms, types, and color variations. In our national list, we have approximately 250 names and synonyms of Greek varieties, whereas in the ampelographic collections of the country, we have more than 550 Greek varieties with their synonyms. Indicatively, I have on this slide various varieties that are allowed or suggested in the vinicultural regions of Greece. There's no need to read each and every one of them. We can just see the sheer number and the names of varieties. And climate change, and what we do is to evaluate these varietal potential we have, so as to adapt the way of cultivating and evaluating some varieties that have a potential to adapt to this increase in temperature. We have in the Peloponnese, we have in Macedonia, Epirus, Thrace, Sterea, Hellas, Thessaly, numerous variations. And from the biotypes, the clones, we can see here the varietal potential, the difference, and all the variations we have in their varieties. So it is an imperative need for an evaluation and assessment of all of them, to record them and assess them. I should like to mention an example to see that even within biotypes of the same variety, there are differences. Differences in the consistency, the chemical consistency of the grapes. So they can be used in the future or in different ground and climatic environments. One such example I have here is of the Corinthian raisin. We have various biotypes. We can see here the grapes, what they look like. They have very small differences in ampelographic characteristics. And what we're interested in is the qualitative characteristics and features. We will not look into each and every one of those numbers, and there's no need to look into these characteristics, but just indicatively we can see that we're talking about the same variety, we have different biotypes. These different biotypes that have been cultivated in the same ground and climatic environment, so the comparison was made using as few variables as possible, and it was the same ampelography that did this ampelographic laboratory. We can see difference in the Brix degrees and grades and sugars and pH and acidity. We can see biotypes with low acidity and some biotypes with high acidity. So these biotypes that by their nature have as a characteristic a high acidity can in fact be used in the future after the temperature has risen. Because the problem with rising temperatures is a reduction in acidity. So when we have high climates, we don't have high acidity, so it is desirable to choose varieties and biotypes with higher acidity now, so that they can be utilized and leveraged in the future. So what we see is that even within the same variety, the assessment and evaluation of biotypes is indeed a very significant tool. These are other qualitative characteristics. We can see here the catechins, epicatechins, procyanidins, total flavanols. We can see a variation here and a fluctuation. We have the cyanidins, we have different colors, the anthocyanins, the things that can be used, antioxidants as well, different non-flavonoid and stilbenes. So the varietal potential is one of the very important ways to deal with it, and something that I will mention in another cultural heritage, because we have the management of our varietal potential that needs to be maintained. It needs to be preserved, it needs to be evaluated and assessed in order to be able to be used in the future. Another measure is the cultivation techniques. I will not tire you too much with this. All we need to say is that we can have different interventions in the early pruning, in the way of installing and supporting. We can see here cups in Santorini. We can see linear vineyards, a traditional way of cultivation. This is the Santorini Assyrtiko variation that has adapted itself to the environment. And the other thing that can be used is various preparations of inert materials that can in fact help the plant physiology, prolong, as it were, the maturation of the grapes, reduce the temperature received by the foliage and the grape, so better maturation and maintenance of the characteristics and features that we desire. Here are various vines we can see. The results we can see from the use of inert materials. Calcium is often used in these interventions based on laboratory tests. We saw results that show a reduction of the foliage temperature by 6.2 and 6.9%, water stress reduction as well. So the plant, in essence, economizes and saves on water. We have a delay in the maturation of the grapes, so a longer maturation period, which means better maturation of the peel. Sugars and phenol potential better. I will not talk about the installation of the vineyard because we said that we have various systems, and we'll see where to install our vineyards is an issue that needs to take into consideration altitude. We need to see the different formula formation and the supports. We'll need to look into different... we appear to have a disconnection. Professor has problems with her connection, I'm afraid. And she's back. Now, according to the 2003 convention that was mentioned by many other previous speakers, is that intangible heritage is defined as the practices, the expressions, knowledge, capacities, capabilities that need to be present in the sites. It's elements, constituent elements of this cultural heritage of ours. So this intangible cultural heritage needs to be passed down from generation to generation. It is constantly changing and adapting, I would say, to the environment and nature and history. And it enhances the identity and cohesion of the communities by promoting respect for cultural difference and human creativity. So this adapted traditional know-how happened, as we saw in Santorini, the way of cultivation. And it was used over time in order to deal with these very difficult climates and climate conditions and climate change. Now, this adapted traditional know-how needs to be preserved and safeguarded as intangible cultural heritage and passed down from generation to generation. So in view of climate change, of great importance is the knowledge of local and indigenous varieties, their identification and preservation for today, but also for the production of viniculture products of high quality in the future. So the aim of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage is the safeguarding of this material, the evaluation and assessment of varieties and the adaptation in a number of ways, as was mentioned earlier, from various techniques to this rise of temperature. I should like to thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor Biniari. I should like to remind everyone to add to all the interesting things that the professor shared with us that traditional raisin production is, in fact, an element of intangible cultural heritage that has been inscribed in the National Inventory of Intangible Cultural Heritage of Greece. And it is very important. Now, it is a natural product. So, thank you so very much. And I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Christos Giannakopoulos. He is Director of Research in the National Observatory of Athens, and he's a national focal point for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Mr. Giannakopoulos will be talking about climate change, impacts and adaptation in Greece. Mr. Giannakopoulos, you have the floor, sir.
So, good morning on my part as well. Thank you for inviting me. I will talk in general about the climate change impact mostly in Greece, as well as for adaptation measures. I will focus on tourism, forestry, agriculture, because these are sectors that are heavily impacted by climate change and the displacement of populations. Clearly, as already stressed by previous speakers, in line with the latest report by the IPCC, the decade spanning between 2010 and 2020 was characterized by an increase in world temperature by 1.09 degrees Celsius compared to one century ago. That means that compared to the late 20th century, there's been an increase in the average temperature globally, and this trend will persist in the future. According to all working assumptions, all scenarios put on the table, this rise in temperature will heavily impact our planet. I will now focus on the Mediterranean region because the rising temperature is actually increasing at a faster pace compared to other regions. So this is a climate change hotspot. This implies a heavy toll for affected biotopes, particularly coastal areas that are threatened by corrosion and flooding. The Mediterranean, as we all know, is the place accommodating many millions of people, and the more than 500 million of people, and it is expected that the demand for water will double or even triple until 2050. So us in particular who are in the southern areas, southern European areas, will experience the impact. What is it that we do within the National Observatory? You have a network of more than 400 automated weather stations. This was launched in 2005 and it is still expanding. We also have the historical climatic station of the National Observatory of Athens that has been formally recognized by the WMO. It has a record of more than 150 years of data, and this is why it is invaluable, because it allows us to identify climate change and its impact in the Athens area, which is a key area for the entire Mediterranean region. On this slide you can see historical data, meaning the air temperature over time in Athens. It shows the number of days in yellow bars where temperature is above 37 degrees Celsius. The red bars demonstrate the days where temperature is over 40 degrees Celsius, and we can see that there is an ongoing increasing trend in the past decades, and the number of days of high temperature is continuously increasing, and we have 3 different 50-year periods, and in the top right chart we have 30, maybe 40 heat incidents of heat wave per every 50-year period. Also, we see that the consecutive days of heat wave is also increasing in recent decades. This is something that does not only involve Athens, but other rural areas as well. We only cite the example of Athens so as to demonstrate the increased frequency of heavy or very heavy rainfall in the past 30 years. We can see 2 different 30-year periods, the first one being 1961 to 1990 and the second one being from 1991 to 2020. So we have different heavy rainfall thresholds, meaning days where rainfall is over 30 or 40 millimeters, 40 to 50 millimeters, and above 50 millimeters. And we can see that the frequency has doubled. So such incidents have become increasingly frequent. This is something that did not occur in the past within the Athens area. And we have a rather fixed annual rainfall, but the number of heavy and very heavy rainfalls has increased. Also, this slide shows the frequency of extremes, that is, record values, and one can see that it is mostly in recent years that Athens has experienced the highest temperatures. For example, in 2007, the highest temperature ever recorded was 44.8 degrees Celsius, but in 2010 we've had the warmest year ever recorded in terms of the mean annual temperature, and it was the year that marked the earliest heat wave ever. Then came 2012. That was the year marking the warmest summer ever. The temperatures, the mean maximum temperature and minimum temperature, exceeded the climatic value by 4 degrees Celsius. Then came 2016 and 2017, again with early heat waves, and in total 5 out of the warmest years occurred between 2010 and 2018. In fact, 2018 was the warmest year as regards minimum temperatures. These are all very significant values because they are closely related to the malaise and discomfort of human population. Also, we can see that we've had extreme conditions as seen and recorded within our observatory. And again, I would like to note that we have a record of more than 150 years of climate data, but one can easily see that extremes occurred in recent years. So what is it that we do? We try to predict the future using climate models. These are very useful tools. Simulation tools used to describe the interaction between the Earth's climate system on the surface, in the poles, and so on. So once we run a climate model, we have climate data available both in terms of the current situation, the present, and the future. In any case, I would like to say that climate data are not necessarily synonymous of climate information. For example, there are private entities, businesses, cooperatives, or even the state itself, ministries, have available specific information, climate information, about their own area of jurisdiction. We have numerous such examples, and like the previous speaker said, one can have data specifically about viniculture and temperatures, for example, in summertime, because this is the period of interest to the vine culturers. So, clearly, when we run a climate model, we have a lot of climate data available that may apply for a number of years to come, but they require processing so as to make forecasts about the future. So we need to assess whether or not these data actually match our observations, and then proceed to the forecasts tailored to the stakeholders and concerned parties' needs. Last but not least, please do not let scales confuse you. Scales are temporal scales. They are different to weather forecast scales. So these scales apply to a number of days that is specified. Weather forecasts cannot exceed 15 days. But then there are simulations about the future that may have a lifetime of 32 days or 15 months or 10 years and so on. In terms of seasonal predictions, for example, these allow the Ministry of the Environment to know what will happen, what will be encountered in the next firefighting season. Will there be a more dry summer? Will it be a windier summer? And so on. So this falls within the concept of seasonal predictions. And given that we're talking about ICH, we will focus on climate change projections. These have a lifetime of 20 to 100 years. So in addition to global climate models, we also have localized climate models. And as you can see, they have a higher degree of spatial analysis. Also, we can actually make use of different climate scenarios to identify possible concentrations of pollutants. Clearly, this depends on the stance adopted by countries globally. This is not something that only has to do with Greece. We're talking about a global phenomenon and global conditions. In line with the Paris Convention, one will talk about the RCP 4.5 or the RCP 6.0. This is a scenario followed. However, we cannot know how will people respond. We cannot know whether or not measures will be introduced by countries. And when we talk about countries, we mostly talk about the US, China, India, Russia. These are the greater countries. So we have different climate scenarios: the mild scenario, the intermediate scenario, and the extreme scenario. Under the last one, pollutant emissions will continue and rise. Our model is the adaptive Greece model. We make use of two different periods. We have the near future, spanning between 2031 and 2060, and the distant future, spanning between 2071 and 2100. And we have a control period. But now I would like to talk about agriculture and farming. Like previous speakers said, there will be a higher demand for water combined with reduced water availability due to prolonged droughts. Also, we will have a desertification. And now you can see an example that might prove useful for agriculture. It shows the number of hot days on the left side, and the other graphs on the top row indicate the near future, and the lower row indicates the distant future. Why is it that we have so many graphs? Because, like I said, we have three different climate scenarios. The mild one that requires the adoption of measures to tackle climate change. We have the moderate scenario and the extreme scenario wherein nothing will be done. We can see that it all comes down to what path we will choose to take. For example, if we follow the mild scenario, in the distant future we will only have an increase of 15 days with hot temperatures. But the scale is very, very different under the extreme scenario, wherein the number of hot days will be more than 60. So you can see that there are great differences, and this also applies to rainfall. If we take into account the extreme scenario, we will have a reduction of the total precipitation that will be significant as opposed to the mild scenario. Another factor that is linked to ICH is tourism. We all know that tourism is a booster industry in Greece, and the climate change may actually affect human health, whereas it will increase energy requirements in terms of cooling and also lead to an increase in wildfires. Last but not least, extreme weather conditions, including the rising sea level, the coastal erosion, will affect the choice of tourist destinations and the tourist industry overall. You can see here an example of heat stress indicating malaise and discomfort among humans. You can see the areas of Greece, particularly the area of Larissa, that will be mostly affected. But if one follows the extreme scenario, the discomfort will increase because there will be an additional 60 days, 2 months of heat wave every year. This will accordingly lead to an increase in the days where a greater energy requirement for cooling purposes will occur. Another risk for Greece is clearly the risk for wildfires. We make use of a fire weather index taking into account the temperature, the wind, the precipitation, and thus we identify the fire risk in the near or distant future. We can see that the number of days with a high fire danger will increase by 20 days in the near future and 40 days a year in the distant future under the extreme scenario. So what is it that we need to do? We must exchange and share knowledge with stakeholders. We need to communicate material so as to promote engagement. We need to agree on the vocabulary, and we need to communicate the certainty or uncertainty, rather, under different scenarios. One cannot safely and accurately predict the climate change future. We also need to generate and develop tools. One of the main tools that is currently in the pipeline is one developed by us in cooperation with the Ministry of the Environment. You can see the relevant links allowing you to visit the project's webpage on the slide. And we have the Adapt to Climate tool, we have the Urban Proof Toolkit, and so on. Please visit our web pages. Also, I would like to talk about adaptation strategies. Clearly, our starting point is the EU adaptation strategy, followed by the national strategy and the regional and local strategies. The national adaptation strategy was introduced by the Ministry of Environment and Energy in cooperation with the Academy of Athens and the Bank of Greece. Its aim is to strengthen the country's resilience to the impacts of climate change. We also have regional adaptation plans. There are 13 such plans in total, and we also have local initiatives undertaken by local authorities. Also, we have the Greek law requiring all regional authorities of Greece to develop their own adaptation plans. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Giannakopoulos. You were very comprehensive and easy to follow. However, you sounded pessimistic. But truth be told, you need to reflect reality, and we need to become aware of the reality so as to better address it. You were very convincing in that sense, but I would like to skip the break because we are lagging behind and pass the floor to Mr. Zhu Gang, who is please excuse me, says the speaker, the moderator. So he is an associate research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a deputy secretary general with the China Folklore Society, and also a facilitator for the UNESCO-Living Heritage Entity. His topic is protecting intangible cultural heritage and the fact that it is conducive to responding to climate change. He will talk to us about Chinese programs for the preservation of intangible and safeguarding of ICH.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for Chairman so much for your kind introduction. And my talk today is climate change and intangible cultural heritage, the case of Chinese traditional knowledge and its viable adaptive strategies to combat climate change. In fact, my field of research includes literature, folklore, anthropology, and heritage studies. Frankly speaking, my prior experiences relating to the issue of climate change and heritage have remained textual only, and my knowledge about it is quite limited. Therefore, in today's presentation, I intend to share some basic thought and immature reflections about the potential contribution of intangible cultural heritage, the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, based on some case studies selected from the practice of safeguarding ICH in the Chinese context. It has been 10 years since the cooperation between China and the CEEC initiated, during which we have witnessed 2 successful expert-level forums. It is a great honor for me to be part of it today, and I look forward to learning from other distinguished speakers and participants that are present online today. As suggested by some researchers, climate change could be approached from a broader perspective of sustainable development, not only because the 2 topics share the same vision, but they also inextricably interlinked to each other. Climate change has a direct impact on natural resources and ecosystems. It is detrimental to the living environment and food security. It also increases disease and mortality of humans and poses threats to the public health. The goals of the Paris Agreement have been integrated to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Several goals of the agenda, such as SDG 1, 2, 6, 14, and 15, are all related to climate change. In short, climate change poses great challenge to sustainable development. On the contrary, it is through sustainable development that climate change will be mitigated and adapted. Culture has an impact on sustainable connections between man and nature, as well as the environment. It is a key dimension to the comprehensive development of humans and serves as the impetus for sustainable development. It is certain that all civilizations and cultures should make their special contribution to sustainable development. As mentioned in the 2003 Convention, Intangible Cultural Heritage refers to the practices, representations, knowledge, skills that communities, groups, and individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible cultural heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to the environment, their interaction with nature and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. In accordance with the spirit of the Convention, considerations will be given solely to ICH that is compatible with the requirement of sustainable development. Indeed, ICH could effectively promote sustainable development through economic, social, and environmental dimensions, thus making its contributions to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. For instance, as one of the 5 domains defined in the Convention, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe include knowledge, know-how, skills, practices, representations developed by communities through interacting with the natural environment. These ways of thinking about the universe are expressed through language, oral tradition, feelings of attachment towards a place, memories, spirituality, and worldview. They also strongly influence values and beliefs and underline many social practices and cultural traditions. They, in turn, are shaped by the natural environment and the community's wider world. Traditional knowledge and practices lie at the heart of a community's culture and identity, but under serious threat of the outcome of modernity. Other factors such as climate change, continuing deforestation, and the ongoing spread of desert inevitably threaten many endangered species and result in the decline of traditional craftsmanship and herbal medicine as raw materials and plant species disappear. Some argue that to safeguard a worldview or system of beliefs is even more challenging than to preserve a natural environment. In contrast, protecting the natural environment is often closely linked to safeguarding a community's cosmology, as well as other examples of its intangible cultural heritage. Although the impact of climate change and its effect on ecosystem and the community's concern is far from being fully addressed, traditional knowledge could offer viable adaptive strategies that can easily be implemented to combat climate change. To further illustrate the point, let us take a quick look at the case from China. Long time ago, the Chinese people found that tea leaves, having been steeped or brewed, could be used to quench thirst, refresh mind, aid digestion, relieve pressure, and support physical and mental health. The knowledge, skills, and practice related to tea making, processing, and sharing have been developed for thousands of years. As a result, a complete knowledge system has been formed, complicated social practice being cultivated, traditional skills being developed, and a variety of artifacts being created. The making, drinking, and sharing of tea are an integral part of the Chinese people's daily life. Having been diffused to other parts of the world through the ancient Silk Road, tea is also enjoyed by people of different genders, nationalities, and countries. Tea making and related social practices are also conducive to the inclusive economy and social development. The making, drinking, and sharing of tea is an important way of social communication. Through the making, brewing, and sharing of tea, a harmonious familial relationship and personal connections are constructed, thus contributing to a strengthened cultural identification and social cohesion. Moreover, tea making involves a wide range of practitioners, workers, and participants. Generations after generation, the social and economic system developed around tea provides sustainable livelihood for the communities, groups, and individuals concerned, including women and the disabled. Nowadays, tea-making economy also helps to promote the increase of income and poverty reduction. Take Anxi County of Zhujiang Province as an example. 800,000 out of 1 million of the local population are involved in the tea industry. Among them, there are about 354,000 women and 7,200 disabled persons. As for the sustainability of the environment, traditional tea making and associated social practices as ICH contributes to the maintenance and the promotion of biodiversity and the natural resources. On the one hand, people consider tea making and relevant social practices as part of their cultural heritage and use them as the cultural capital to recognize and identify with each other. As a result, the cultural significance of tea guides people to constantly strengthen and expand the cultivation area of tea and to cultivate different types of tea trees. For instance, one of the ancient tea plantations in Yunnan province ages more than 1,800 years. According to statistics, in 2021, the tea planting area in China reached around 3 million hectares. Hundreds of varieties of tea types could be found within the 4 major areas in China. On the other hand, tea production is sensitive to ecological conditions and susceptible to climate change. With knowledge that has been passed down for generations, local people could manage cultivation of tea trees, the management of tea plantation, as well as the processing of tea leaves on a sustainable basis, which enables them better cope with climate change and environmental sustainability. For instance, proper locations for planting different types of tea are carefully selected according to their growth characteristics and requirements for ecological conditions. Those fragile ecological areas will not be chosen to develop tea-related industry. The significant role of tea in rural development, poverty reduction, and food security in developing countries have been confirmed by United Nations. The 74th General Assembly decided to designate 21st of May as International Tea Day. The day will promote and foster collective actions to implement activities in favor of the sustainable production and consumption of tea and will raise awareness of its importance in fighting hunger and poverty. As pointed out by UN, tea production and processing contribute to the reduction of extreme poverty, the fight against hunger, the empowerment of women, and the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystem. Moreover, there is an urgent need to raise public awareness of the importance of tea for rural development and sustainable livelihood, and to improve the tea value chain to contribute to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Let's now move to another case, 赤水丹霞 landform in Guizhou, China. Danxia landform is characterized by red cliffs and erosional landforms. 赤水 in Guizhou province and 5 other places in southern China were collectively included in the World Heritage List under the title of Danxia Landform of China in 2010. 赤水 enjoy a high forest coverage rate of more than 82%. Among the abundant biological resources that赤水has in stock, bamboo resource is the most iconic. With over 86,000 hectares of bamboo forest,赤水is known as China's top 10 bamboo habitat. Bamboo has become an important source of livelihood for residents. It has entered people's daily life in various forms, such as hairpin, boat, lampshade, plate, tea utensils, and umbrellas. Slender bamboo strips are even used as local means of transportation. 赤水 carving, weaving technique, and amazing bamboo drifting tradition have been recognized as the representative ICH element at all levels in China. Bamboo shoulders new responsibility given its strong capacity in carbon sequestration and emission reduction. Durable bamboo products can help reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. They also have the potential of reducing light pollution as they could be used as substitute for plastics. This natural and cultural heritage transmitted from the past have regained vitality in the new era, and become important resources for local sustainable development. 赤水 bamboo weaving technique have been included in UNESCO's Sustainable Livelihood Program of World Heritage Site in cooperation with China. The program aims to provide sustainable livelihood for local communities by integrating natural and cultural, tangible and intangible cultural heritage, and leveraging the role of culture in eradicating poverty, promoting gender equality, boosting economic growth and employment, and combating climate change. Efforts will also be made to study the role of bamboo in carbon sequestration and emission reduction, and its potential as consumer product, explore low carbon development model in rural area, increase rural resilience against climate change, and make contribution to the realization of China's dual carbon goals by 2030 and 2060. To conclude, climate change and sustainable development are both extremely important for the destiny of humans, mankind. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres emphasized on World Environment Day this year, we can no longer ignore the alarm bells that ring louder every day. Our only way forward is to work with nature, not against it. To combat climate change and achieve sustainable development, changing of mindset seems necessary and inevitable. Without culture, development cannot be sustained. Intangible cultural heritage is the outcome of harmonious interactions between man and nature, and is the historical construction of humans and their perception toward the nature and themselves. The aforementioned examples have displayed clearly the positive role ICH can play in combating climate change and achieving sustainable development. Let us work together to better safeguard ICH through sustainable development and try our best to make positive contributions to the mitigation and the adaptation of climate change. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ το...
Thank you, Mr. Zhu Gang, for your contribution, a very significant contribution to our meeting today. I should like to remind everyone who are not very familiar with the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage that China is in fact one of the most active countries in implementing this convention. And of course, the contribution of China and Mr. Gang's contribution in today's meeting is in fact a very important one in conveying the experience from his country. Thank you very much for that, sir. Despite the fact that we are slightly, if not too much, out of time, we definitely need to have a short break, a 10-minute break, at least to give our fantastic interpreters for a breather, to rest so that we can continue with a better disposition, with a better utilization of all these beautiful questions that have been raised so far. So let's go to a brief 10-minute break and we'll be right back.